This is the Stonebridge podcast. I'm publisher and editor-in-chief Peter Goodman. This is our second podcast, so we're just kind of getting our sea legs, as it were. But if there's a like button somewhere and you like what you hear, please press it and let it, or write to us. Let us know what you'd like to hear, because we're in the process of developing this, and hopefully we'll be able to deliver some interesting episodes and good programming and good guests like we have today. Talking about today, we are talking about food, Japanese food in particular. And every day, I imagine all of us are talking about food. I mean, it's certainly on our minds. Food is a big part of our life. But I think we often don't think so much about where our food comes from and the whole ecosystem that the food derives from, the way that food interacts with our lives and our cultures, and particularly its history and what it means to the people who grow it, as well as the people who find it and consume it and study it, etc. And so we've got somebody who's spent a lot of time thinking about those kind of things, and that is Winifred Bird. I think we can call her Winnie Bird. And she wrote a book called Eating Wild Japan, which Stonebridge Press was very, very proud to publish last year. It is among my personal favorites of all the books I've ever read about Japan, and in particular, all the books that we published about Japan at Stonebridge Press. I have a couple reasons for saying that. It is remarkably well written, but beyond that, it's one of those books that you think you kind of know what it's about when you buy it, because it's like Eating Wild Japan. Oh, it's like about, foraging food in Japan. And that's kind of a narrow topic. It seems like a specialized topic, but when you start reading it, you realize the book is actually about a lot more than that. It's about culture, it's about politics, it's about public policy, as well as being about food. And there are some just scrumptious descriptions of all the different kinds of food that you can get in Japan. So reading it is, let's say you can devour the book and really taste its deliciousness as you go. And it's delicious in a lot of different ways. It's got recipes in it, for one thing, lots of lists of ingredients, but it's also a fascinating look at food culture, and particularly this one little slice of food culture in rural Japan. There are probably very, very few people who could write it with the authority that Winnie brings to it. She lived in Japan for almost 10 years, rural Japan most of the time, so probably not a lot of access to McDonald's and fast foods, and maybe that in desperation drove her to the forest to find better things to eat there. But like I say, I really just love the book, and I'm really looking forward to talking with Winnie about it more today. So welcome, Winnie. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you, Peter, for having me, and thank you for that kind introduction. It was a pleasure to write the book.
Well, I meant every morsel of it. So there are just so many things to talk about, because like I say, your book is really about all sorts of different aspects of food. But let's start by just you kind of setting the scene. You were living in Japan. You were a journalist. What was your particular interest in going out into the countryside and finding out more about food there?
Well, I was working as a journalist, a freelance journalist, but I was also living in rural Japan and gardening and farming, actually. I had a rice field with ducks in it and a huge garden. I've always loved that kind of thing. And my husband at the time also had a background in agriculture. So we were very much spending our time in the countryside, growing food, eating food, thinking about food all the time. And I think because of that, I naturally started to come into contact with some of the wild foods and the foraging culture, which is very much still a part of rural life in Japan. So it's hard if you're there not to come into contact with it. But I was also fortunate enough to be living in the Japan Alps outside of the city of Matsumoto, which has a really strong culture of gathering sansai, which is the Japanese word for mountain vegetables, because the winter there lasts so long into the spring. It's really May before you can start getting anything from your own garden. But fortunately, a lot of the wild edible plants you can start harvesting quite a bit earlier, even a few months earlier, because they're perennials, which means they stay in the ground for more than 1 year. They grow for more than 1 year. So they kind of get a head start on all the annuals in the gardens. So people really make that a part of their spring diet in that area.
Well, is that a lot of people there that make that a part of their spring diet, or is it like the young people, maybe they're eating soba in the soba shops and not paying too much attention to that. Is it a general custom to do that?
I would say that eating foraged foods or wild plants is a much more of a mainstream part of Japanese food culture than it is a part of American food culture today, even though it's become kind of trendy here in the United States. In Japan, it has always been a really important part of what people eat. Of course, if you're in the city, it's wild foods have more of a symbolic role, like you'll eat a little bit here and there in the spring, but it won't be like the bulk of what you're eating, obviously. Where I was living, which was a traditional farming neighborhood, apple growing area, there were a lot of older people, but younger people as well. And for them, it was a bit different. Like we would go to the spring picnic under the cherry blossom trees at the local little ball field. And everybody would just open up their bento boxes full of, fern fiddleheads and fukinoto and tsukushi or things like that, which I was totally unaccustomed to and I thought was just really cool.
Well, could you also buy the forage foods in local like vegetable shops?
Sure. Yeah. Some of them sometimes they're picked wild and sold at stores, and sometimes they're grown on farms. So there's like this kind of blurring between what is a wild food and what is a cultivated food, because some cultivated foods have gone wild, kind of escaped the farm, and you can find them growing in the wild. And some of the wild foods have become cultivated because it makes production easier for the market.
Right. Well, when I go out in a local park here, there are lots of things I see on the ground, and I very rarely think, oh, I could eat that. Doesn't really occur to me. And if somebody said, well, you can eat a lot of stuff, I wouldn't know where to begin. So how did you start the process of finding out what was edible, and then where to find it, and how to prepare it?
Right. Well, first of all, let me say that when I go out to the park, the first thing I think is, what can I eat? Yeah, that's just maybe a personal difference between you and me, but
it's never occurred to me.
So I was fortunate enough to have some mentors in picking wild foods where I lived in Japan. I had been interested a little bit in the United States as well, like picking blackberries and dandelion greens and things like that. But I really got into it when I was living there in Nagano Prefecture. One of my neighbors who I write about in the book, Ban-san, an older woman, she was in her 80s, who had grown up and spent her whole life in the neighborhood and had a real kind of a connection, felt a strong connection with the natural world and plants. She kind of befriended me and started making some of these foods for me, and then taking me out to the place where she would gather them and teaching me a little bit. And some other women in the neighborhood started doing the same thing. So that kind of helped me dip my toe into it. When I started writing the book, I got dove in head first with just seeking out people who were very knowledgeable about all of these foods and learning from them. I really, really prefer to learn from people, although I did a lot of book research as well for the book. But my personal preference is to learn about plants by going out with people who have that knowledge and wisdom. It just, for some reason, sinks in better with me to learn it through people than through the internet or an app or something like that.
Did you make day trips? Or did you make longer trips out? There were specially designed excursions for food gathering, foraging, meeting people?
So during research for the book, do you mean, or prior to that?
Oh, prior to that.
So previously it was more just like, hey, it's Nazuna season. Would you like to come out? My neighbor might say, my friend has a lot of Nazuna growing in her field and she doesn't use any chemicals. Would you like to come with me over to her field and pick some? Or, hey, are you free tomorrow afternoon? Let's go check out the bracken and ostrich fern fiddleheads. So it was really more like that until I started working on the book.
Now, I am I guess I describe myself as an ex-Japanese speaker, since I don't have much occasion to use it. When I was living in Japan, I got around fairly comfortably. What was a challenge for you? Was there a language challenge? I mean, as a gaijin, a foreigner going out doing this sort of thing, you were already marked as rather strange, I suppose. There probably weren't too many people who were pursuing this. You don't make a lot of your, say, foreignness in your book, that's not really an issue. You don't talk about, cultural differences so much. You're actually right there and you're talking to people. So you seem like you were extremely well integrated into the language and culture of the people that you were talking to, even though I suppose a lot of those food words were very arcane. I mean, probably a lot of Japanese people didn't know them the way that a lot of Americans don't know the names of their local plants.
Sure. Yeah. Well, there's a lot to that question. By that point, I had been living in Japan for a while. I was pretty comfortable with the language. My husband at the time was Japanese. We spoke Japanese at home. I had been doing environmental journalism for a number of years and really learning a lot of vocabulary connected to nature and plants through that. With every article I wrote, I would kind of have to learn the relevant words. So I was gaining a stock of these kind of words. And then, right, as I moved into writing about wild edible plants, I did the same thing. I started by reading about them, which is usually what I do, reading in Japanese to get a sense of how people talk about the subject in Japanese and start to try to pick up some of that language. But as for conversation, I was pretty comfortable. And I think I did have the advantage always of people receiving me with a welcome, open attitude because I showed an interest in what many people view as a very important and valuable part of their culture. And I was recognizing that and reaching out to them on that basis.
So you think your foreignness was a bit of an advantage there, at least as gaining entree and getting people to open up, perhaps?
Yeah. I think people gave me the benefit of the doubt because I had gotten as far as taking an interest in this obscure, somewhat obscure part of Japanese culture and learning enough to even ask for an interview or ask the question, So people kind of respond well to that, I think. What
were some of the places you went to? In your book, if you look at the map, you kind of went all the places. What were some of the memorable places that you visited?
Yeah, it was totally an excuse for me to go to all the terrific places that I wanted to go in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the mountains. And I went all the way up to Hokkaido, from Hokkaido down to Kyushu. Yeah, in Hokkaido, I spent some time with an Ainu community, a number of hours from Sapporo, and some women there who were working with a kind of food history of their culture, the Ainu culture in that area, documenting it, talking to some of the older elders about what they used to cook and what they used to gather, and kind of trying to revive that food culture. That was an amazing trip. I went to Iwate Prefecture, also in northern Honshu, not quite as far north as Hokkaido, and also, other parts of northern Japan. That's kind of like the heartland of Sansai, because again, of the cold climates, like I mentioned in Nagano. I also went down to the Aso caldera in Kyushu, which is kind of a much different climate, a warmer southern climate, but still a very rich tradition of using wild edible plants. So I really got to go all over the place.
And you also went to a coastal town in western Japan where they had a big, or was that Kyushu where they had the seaweed industry, or Shikoku?
Yeah, so I did go to one community in Shikoku. To learn about seaweed. So that was a place where they grew wakame. And also I was able to ferret out one person who still gathered it wild, because it used to be harvested, natural wakame used to be harvested along with many different other kinds of seaweed. And I think it was the 50s or 60s, they transitioned to farming the seaweed. And by now, most people by the time I was there, almost everyone had stopped gathering it wild. Right.
So these places there at the seaweed or the kelp farm, and other places where they've begun cultivating some of the wild plants, is that done for economic reasons, or is it partly done to make sure that there's a good supply of that, or there's a greater demand for it than the local forest can possibly support? It's kind of a convenience. Because we don't see, I think about, certainly don't see at my local Safeway, the big grocery store chain out here, but even the smaller shops, we don't see a lot of, strange things that seem to have been, gathered from forest floors. But it's different in Japan?
So take the example of wakame. The way that people eat today does not mesh well with the way that nature produces food. So it doesn't really work well with foraging. People want to have wakame in their misos. I mean, millions and millions of people want to have wakame in their miso soup every day of the year, pretty much. In the restaurants and at home, it's, have a little few pieces
Right.
floating in your soup. You have your seaweed salads. They want to have a larger amount of a smaller number of different foods, right? So less diversity in terms of variety and more quantity of those things. And they want a steady supply and a steady, consistent quality. And all of those things you just don't get from foraged foods. You have a great diversity of plants that you can pick and eat throughout the year and throughout the country, but you don't have a huge quantity of anything. And some years you might not have anything. You might have a bad year for something one year. And that doesn't really work in the modern economy and the modern food system. So people switched over also for the sake of having a more stable income for themselves, more predictable. That's something that we all kind of want in our jobs, right? So as the technologies evolved and the market evolved, people switched to farming, cultivated foods in a lot of cases.
I would infer from that, though, that there's a demand for these foods. Otherwise, people wouldn't go the work of cultivating it. They would just say, well, just go gather it yourself. So is that a sign, perhaps, that Japanese eating habits in a general terms are more healthy than, say, they are here in the United States?
Yeah, I would probably say that's true. I mean, I'm sure there's exceptions to everything. And you can go out in Japan and get gigantic deep fried pork chop over a big bowl of white rice on any street corner, pretty much. Right. And, but I would say my experience living there is that a lot of people I knew ate a great diet with just lots of vegetables and sea vegetables and just great diversity in the diet and nice balance and freshness. And I really was impressed with the way people ate there still in many families, especially the home cooking. I feel like home cooking is still much more of an art there for the mass population than it is for us.
Do you have any theories as to why that might be so? Or is it just kind of how things are?
Honestly, I think part of it probably has to do with the fact that a lot of women stop working after they get married and are at home taking care of the kids, and there's cultural expectations and demands that they will do that cooking, and which is great and horrible at the same time. Whereas here, we're considered lucky that we can all go off to work for 8 or 10 hours a day outside the home and are too tired to do much of that by the time we get done.
Well, when we go to Japanese restaurants here in the United States, I mean, obviously they're not all the same, and there are some that are very, very, very high end. But for the most part, it's kind of the same sort of menu. Do you feel that Japanese restaurants here are a pretty good representation of the kinds of foods that ordinary people are eating in Japan, or are we missing something? And in particular, what kind of dishes would you like to see on Japanese restaurants here in the United States?
Well, I would say it's getting better. There's in cities, at least, I think my impression is that there's a much greater diversity of wider representation of different kinds of Japanese foods here. I don't really know that because I live in the rural Midwest and we have little good Japanese food. It's far and few between for a good Japanese restaurant here. But I would say, first of all, nimono. When I went to Japan, I was like, wait, people are eating things, root vegetables simmered in soy sauce and sugar every day in Japan. What is this? Very common home cooking dishes like that, that I had no idea even existed. So I would say there's just such a huge diversity of it within Japanese cuisine that is traditional and as well as innovative stuff. And yeah, probably for most people, they only see a tiny fraction of that here in the United States, which makes sense. It's not Japan. We're not living in Japan, but it's nice to see a little bit more of that making its way here.
So, and some of the recipes you have in the book are they're provided with the idea, I suppose, that people could actually try to make some of the foods here. But of course, I mean, one of the things you hear from people who have bought the book is that, well, I can't get those ingredients.
Yeah.
And I guess that's a bit of a challenge, but I maybe the book can be kind of an inspiration for people to find edible things here and experiment with them. At least use some of the same cooking techniques and condiments, etc., that they use in Japan.
Yeah. So I had a couple of goals with the recipes. One was just to give people a sense of how Japanese cooks, home cooks, prepare these foods. So even if you don't cook it yourself, you can see what people do with them. But more than that, it was kind of just to present the basic techniques that people use to prepare wild foods. So the recipes are meant more as, I would say, templates than as specific recipes where you have to make them with the ingredients given, the specific wild foods given in the recipe. Now, that said, a lot of the plants mentioned in the book do grow in the United States in various areas and can be found here, or similar plants can be found here. For example, I discovered this spring that goutweed, I don't know if you know the plant goutweed.
No.
It's kind of this like low herbaceous plant. Oftentimes it's variegated, like it has green with white mottling on it. And it's considered a bit invasive. In many places, it's planted as a landscaping plant and then it gets out and takes over. Anyway, there's a lot of it around my house, and I discovered that it's edible and that it tastes like really similar to a couple Japanese plants, wild plants like seri and ashtaba a little bit, which I can't find here. So I was really excited about that. And, you could use, there's a couple of the recipes, like there's something called nameshi that I give a recipe for in the book that's basically just steamed white rice, cooked white rice with blanched, chopped wild greens mixed into it with a little, I think, salt and sesame seeds. So it's a very simple recipe where you could really substitute anything, but goutweed makes a nice substitute because it has a similar aroma and flavor to something that would be used more traditionally in Japan.
Do you find that the locavore phenomenon here in America is borrowing anything from Japan? Do you think it has any staying power, or is it just kind of one of those food trends? And of course, if you go to one of those restaurants, it's extremely expensive usually. I mean, for good reason, but it's not like something that could catch on at tables across America necessarily.
Yeah.
Seems a little elitist, if you know what I mean.
And I hate that. It should not be elitist. It's like the most basic thing in the world to be able to go outside of your house and find a plant growing and take it home and eat it. Like, how much more basic can you get? It's not just humans. That's like animals living on the earth. That's something we all share. Like that, if you're talking about a basic right, that is one of them, in my opinion. Sadly, that is not possible for so many people for so many reasons. It has become elitist because of a lack of access to natural environments or pollution that, runoff. You're not supposed to pick things next to a road because you have the gasoline fumes and all sorts of stuff getting into the soil, or, environmental racism. Certain neighborhoods don't have much greenery around them. Certain people, some people have to work 2 jobs and they don't have time to do any of that. So there's a lot of reasons why it has become kind of a privilege to be able to do these things, which really should be available to everybody, I think.
And the situation in Japan is different in that regard?
I think all the same issues exist, and there's a huge trend in Japan of urbanization that's still going on. People leaving the small mountain villages for many reasons, many of them economic, just lack of jobs or education opportunities. People move to the big cities. They lose a connection with the culture that is rooted in the local ecology and environment, and are not able to kind of build those same kind of deep connections with the history and culture related to plants.
But, I mean, you seem to suggest at the beginning that this practice of foraging is actually well integrated into Japanese communities. Certainly, even in you lived in a city. It was in the mountains, but it was still a city. But even there, many people did that. Young people, they kind of knew their plants. They ate them. They expect to eat them, and they didn't cost a fortune. They were kind of locavoring was just like built into daily life. Do you feel that may be changing in Japan, or has the Japanese government or the provincial authorities recognized the importance of food culture to their communities and are taking steps to say, protect the environment and to encourage areas where can be set aside for foraging that are not going to be developed?
Yeah, it's so complicated. I think lots of people do recognize the importance of it. To quote Joni Mitchell, though, like, you don't know what you got till it's gone. It is starting to fade, those cultures and those connections, and people are realizing, oh, wait, we're losing something important, even though it's still a stronger element of the culture, I would say, than it is here in the United States. It is still threatened by many different economic and social developments. So people do want to value it and protect it, but it's something that was once an integral part of the way people lived. And now it is being protected as kind of like something by itself, something special, something set aside. So you're going to protect parts of it, but not all of it. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, it's not the same. I mean, if you just sort of create a separate park for like, they have a park where Minka, the old farmhouses are,
Sure.
They're all in a cluster there, but it's not real life. You can go there and appreciate what it was. It's kind of like a museum. I don't know if you're going to have a Sansai museum exactly. I'm not sure that's the right way of thinking about it, but it's losing its direct day-to-day integration into life there.
Yes, that's true in a lot of places. But the really great thing about picking wild edible plants and cooking and eating them is that you can really do it anywhere. Like, these plants are so resilient and so prevalent and so just like generous and like, wow, I just thank them for existing, because like with everything we've done to the world, they are still out there like hanging on, and there for us to experience and get to know and make part of our life and our culture. So like, it's definitely not too late, and it's not too late to start learning or to start reconnecting with those parts of Japanese culture or American culture. And I really encourage people to not be like intimidated by it or afraid. Many people are kind of afraid to eat something that wasn't grown in a garden or a farm. I have friends like this. Actually, my husband used to kind of be like this. When I'd be like, let's pick this and eat this, he'd be like, are you trying to kill me?
Well, we do have a disclaimer on the copyright page saying, we're not responsible if you eat something you shouldn't. Well, so how does someone get a start? I mean, who knows nothing or is intimidated, as you say? Can you give any tips for how to get going on it?
My suggestion would be to connect with a local foraging group or a person who is knowledgeable about it to get started. You're going to feel a lot more confident that way, learning, than just going out there with your little handbook and a magnifying glass, because there's a lot of knowledge that doesn't make it into the books that you kind of need to have in order to safely be.
Yeah, well, I mean, some of the plants, I guess, are dangerous, and you don't want to just eat without knowing what you're eating. But also, as you point out in your book, some of the plants are only tasty for a certain period, or if they're prepared in a particular way. And so you really can't just go out there and start like picking stuff and eating it. It's all there's a tremendous amount of lore that goes with these foods.
Yes, do not under any circumstances go out and just pick something and eat it. You always have to know with confidence what you are doing, what you are picking, and how to prepare it. Yeah, and many of the plants mentioned in the book, especially Japanese sansai, I noticed like do require some processing to make them taste good, like akunuki, like taking away the bad flavors. It's called in Japanese, basically. Be that blanching it or soaking it in water with wood ash or baking soda mixed into it, or something much more elaborate in the case of horse chestnuts, where it has to be soaked for weeks in running water and boiled. And, that's not something for the amateur, obviously, right. But there are highly evolved ways of cooking these plants to make them more palatable.
And you figure that in most areas in our country and the United States that there are people who know this stuff, and there are foraging groups, and people should be able to figure it out.
Yeah, yeah. And these days, the internet is your friend.
Right.
Social media, I mean, Facebook, I joined a group in it's like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Illinois or something. And they're out there. The plant people are there. And if you start looking for them, you'll find them. Also, Instagram has a ton of great wild edible food accounts to follow. And that's a good way to connect with people as well.
And what about shopping for some of these things? What kind of place do you think a person should go and try and find even some of the cultivated foods?
I wouldn't necessarily try to shop for the plants. You might find something here or there, but for me, like part of the whole point of cooking these foods is, to pick them and yourself and prepare them. But as for the Japanese ingredients, there's great Japanese grocery stores all over the place. Even, I used to go to one outside of Chicago that had pretty much everything I needed.
Really?
And yeah. Just serving the Japanese American community or workers posted overseas from Japan at Japanese car factories or whatever, or car manufacturers in the Midwest. It's surprising where you find pockets of Japanese culture here in the United States.
Yeah. Well, one bit of exciting news, there is a translation of your book coming out in Japan, which is maybe like carrying coals to Newcastle in a way. But you've been in touch with a translator, and what's that whole experience been like? Because you have been somewhat involved in the creation of the translation.
Yeah, it's been so interesting because I also work as a translator, but to be on the other end of the stick this time, see what it's like to have my own book translated has been really fascinating. I think the translator has done a great job. He's done all his due diligence in terms of research. He has my back in terms of checking and double checking everything in the book, which is nice to know because that's obviously the concern when you're writing about somebody else's culture in their own language. Many Japanese people are very familiar with much of the content of the book. So I want to be sure to get it right, but hope to also add like a different perspective, which I think will be the appeal of it. What does a foreigner see in Sansai and Sansai culture?
Well, one of the interesting things, of course, is that you would cite Japanese texts and you would translate them and not present the original. And when they use that same material, they actually have to go back to the original text and use that and not your translation.
Exactly. Luckily, I was like pretty meticulous in writing down like what page and where I got everything from. So hopefully it wasn't too much of a huge hassle for him. But the one area where I think he may have actually improved it was where I talk about that historic record in Iwate Prefecture of different famines and agricultural kind of events. I used kind of modern summary of that historic document, whereas he actually went to the historic document itself, I believe, and got the real original quotes, which is wonderful. But that was something I wasn't able to do because I can't read historic Japanese. It was just beyond me.
Yeah.
But he was able to do that.
And he's there's going to be is it like a Zoom event or some kind of online event about the book? And are you participating or about translation, is it?
Yeah, he has said that there's going to be quite a bit of promotion for it in Japan and some online events, I believe, with some bookstores. We don't have the details yet, but I will definitely share them.
Well, when you share them with us, we'll share them with our community as well. That sounds great. I've been privy to some of the communications between you and the translator, and he really loves the book. He's so impressed by the information that's in it. For him, I don't think it's just a job. He's really made a passion out of getting it right. So it's been fascinating to watch.
Yeah, I feel lucky to have found somebody who has that depth of interest and appreciation for the topic. So hopefully it's going to be a great translation.
Great. Well, we look forward to it. Well, it's been great talking with you today, Winnie. The book is called Eating Wild Japan, Tracking the Culture of Forage Foods with a Guide to Plants and Recipes, which I should mention, there are recipes at the back of the book, and there's a whole glossary of plants with all their scientific names, description, their habitats, what parts of them are edible, etc. So in addition to being a fascinating book about Japanese food culture, it's also a great starting reference guide if you want to learn more about those particular plants, and in particular how to prepare them in your own home. Lots of interesting and simple sounding, to me at least, ways of preparing them. The book is also illustrated by Paul Pointer. It has wonderful atmospheric, simple line drawings of the plants and the people who are involved in cultivating them. So thank you very much, Winnie. Good luck on your future cooking endeavors.
Yeah, thank you. It was great to talk to you. I always love talking about wild edible plants. So thanks for today.
To find out more about Stonebridge Press and our books and authors, go to www.stonebridge.com. You can find our Substack, The Stone Bridge, at stonebridgepress.substack.com, and you can visit and message us on Twitter at Stonebridge Pub or on Facebook at Stonebridge Press. To reach us by regular email, write to us at sbp@stonebridge.com.